So we'll move on to our next topic, talking a little bit about the Iowa's dairy industry, the economic impact of that. So our colleague from Northeast Iowa here, Jen Bentley, who has been working with us in Extension as a dairy field specialist for about 10 years. Previous to that, she was with the Northeast Iowa Dairy Foundation. And so both an Iowa dairy survey that we had taken out and also the study that was done on the Iowa dairy industry. So Jen, take her away.
Hello, and welcome to this presentation of Iowa's dairy industry, past, present, and future. My name is Jen Bentley, and I'm the Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist for Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. In this 30-minute video, we will take a quick tour of where Iowa's dairy industry has been, what it looks like today, and what producers are telling us it may look like in the future. We recently completed a comprehensive review of Iowa's dairy industry that allowed us to update the economic impact data numbers, and we'll take a sneak peek into some of the preliminary data we received back from Iowa's dairy producers in 2020. As you can see by my collage of pictures, which are all photos captured in Iowa, we have a diverse landscape of operations from grazing to robots and everything in between. But I think what you'll find interesting today is they're all important to Iowa's economy. So let's first take a step back in time, back to 1925. As you look at this map, each cow represents 1,000 dairy cows, and you can see every county in Iowa had cows, totaling 689,000 cows. Back then, everyone milked cows, along with having hogs, crops, and beef. Cows back then produced about 4,000 pounds of milk per cow per year, totaling 27.5 million pounds of milk. Then we fast forward 72 years later, and the dairy landscape looks quite a bit different as we start to see farms become more specialized within specific livestock or cropping areas. And remember on this map that one cow still represents 1,000 cows. As you begin to see our central counties milking less than 1,000 cows as the farms shift to east or west sides of the state. Cow numbers declined to 220,000. However, these cows were producing 4 times more milk, averaging 16,100 pounds annually, totaling 35.5 million pounds. So much of this can be attributed to learning more about cows' nutrition, improved forage quality and harvesting and storage practices, and facilities that make our cows more comfortable as we see an industry change from tie stalls to free stalls, use of sand bedding, etc. Then we take another snapshot forward into 2015 and again see cows headed east or west. This map shows an increased trend to the cows moving to Northwest Iowa. If any of you eat Blue Bunny ice cream, you know that that's in Plymouth County. So much of that milk being produced is in those counties are being made into ice cream. Cow numbers went down slightly in this map from 220,000 down to 207,000, but production per cow continues to increase at 22,444 pounds per cow, with an overall total milk production of 4.6 billion pounds of milk. So we can start to see we use the word more sustainability here. As we look from 1925 to 2015, Iowa's dairy cows became more efficient, producing 5 times more milk with about 30% less cows. This leads us to our first poll question. I'll give you a few moments here to look at this chart and take in the information. Take note when you look at this graph, the data actually reads from right to left. So the oldest date, 1924, going to the left is the most current to 2018. So my poll question is from 1924 to present, when was the peak or the highest number of cows? And if you answered 1934, you would be correct with 1.5 million cows, a record high according to the NASS data. Iowa still had over 1 million cows in the early 1960s, but look at the graph from 1956 to 1975. What was happening? More dairies were converting over to grain farming. Numbers dropped below 200,000 in the late 1990s, but we've rebounded to 220,000 today. and a lot more milk per cow and the total overall total. So the question is here, are we at peak milk production or will we still continue to climb? I'd venture to guess we are still on our way up to more milk per cow as we see current industry trends. The last few graphs showed cow numbers in the state. Now let's look at actual dairy farms. Again, reading this graph from right to left, indicating in 2003, Iowa had nearly 2,500 farms, to the most current NASS data in 2018 with just over 1,000 farms. So NASS doesn't have complete farm data for every year, but I do want to point out, just for a point of reference, that in 1984, there were approximately 6,000 dairy herds in the state of Iowa. So we'll look at more current numbers here in an upcoming slide. I really like this map from the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship Dairy Bureau. They update this map about every 6 months, and this is the most recent licensed dairy map from January of 2021. So similar to our earlier maps of the state, this shows most of the farms, again, located in our eastern and northwest parts of the state, totaling 1,104 farms, which includes 195 dairy goats and 1 dairy sheep farm. But if we take out the goats and the sheep, Iowa currently has 907 dairy cow farms, down about 124 farms from the last updated map that we had like this. This decline of dairy farms was reflected around the country as licensed dairy farms declined by 2,700 farms to a new total of 37,468 total farms in the United States. So Wisconsin, the state with the most dairy farms, saw a 6.5% drop, along with Pennsylvania, Michigan, California experiencing similar declines. The severe declines in dairy farm operations were caused primarily by the steady decline in milk prices. Many dairy farmers experienced 4 years of losses, and the revised dairy margin coverage just couldn't help them resurrect their operations. However, those farms who were able to weather the drop in milk prices are expected to gain steadily in the next 5-year period. Economic recovery, farm consolidation and automation, and a steadily increasing demand for dairy products, both nationally and internationally, is expected to contribute to farm profitability. This next slide is what you'll find in the comprehensive review of Iowa's dairy industry publication. You might ask, well, these numbers look different from the previous slides I just mentioned. However, this number reflects 2017 Iowa Ag Census data numbers and includes anyone who may have just 1 or 2 milking cows and not necessarily selling milk to a licensed cooperative. So as you can see on this map, it shows 1,592 herds are represented here, with herd sizes 0 to 19 making up about 29% of the herds. And of those 29%, only 25% of those are actually milking less than 10 cows. So they really represent a really small portion of the milk sales, less than 1% of milk sales. So these herds really use the milk production for more on-farm usage than they do for selling of milk. So if we take that milk or take those herds out of the equation and just look at total licensed dairies, this 2017 Iowa Ag Census actually shows 1,131 herds. So we take those 463 herds that milk less than 20 cows, we get a better representation of our herd size throughout the state. And it parallels a little bit better with the Department of Ag numbers. So as you're looking here, 21% were milking less than 50 cows and 34% between 50 and 99 cows, totaling about 50% of our herds milking less than 100 cows. So milk production per cow has gone from 4,000 pounds per cow, like I mentioned, back in 1924, to nearly 25,000 pounds per cow here in 2020. The steep and steady climb from 1956 to present includes enhanced genetics, accounting for about 50 to 60% of those gains, and enhanced management of the other 50%. So less cows and herds, but more likely more milk per cow. So while Iowa has been increasing total milk the past 2 decades, peak milk production has increased, occurring in 1943 at 6.9 billion pounds. So remember, there were still over 1 million dairy cows up to that point, up until the late 1950s. And so combined with higher milk production meant over 6 million pounds of milk being produced. Iowa's dairies are complemented by an equally diverse group of processors, and they're located strategically throughout the state, based on those maps that we saw in the eastern half or the northwestern half of the states, which strengthens Iowa's ability to deal with seasonal peaks and valleys in milk production. Currently, there are 22 processors in Iowa, with some manufacturing more than one product. So we have 12 processors of fluid milk, 2 dry milk plants, 17 cheese processors, and 7 ice cream processors. So this diversified production, processing, and support system really helps create stable and attractive regional price trends, and it provides opportunities for individual dairy farms to grow and meet those changes in national demand. We know that milk is a staple food, and it's recommended that Americans consume 3 cups per day of milk and dairy products. In 2018, Americans consumed 646 pounds of milk and dairy products. So that's representing more than 211 billion pounds of raw milk. The total US dairy farms, they produce 217 billion pounds of raw milk. And so Iowa's contribution to that is just a little over 2.5%, producing 5.6 billion pounds. So although US fluid milk sales have decreased by about 13%, the mix of some of these products, the total is changing. We're seeing reflection in increased consumption of whole milk and flavored milk, and a little decrease in more of the skim buttermilk sales. So previously, we looked at this chart from the Iowa Ag Census 2017 as a percentage of farms by herd size. Now we're looking at percent of milk by herd size. Keeping in mind the average herd size in Iowa is right around 200 cows. The herds with cows that range between 20 and 49 cows accounted for about 3% of the total milk supply. And then we have herds over 200 cows that are accounting for nearly 70% of that milk supply. We do have a few herds over that 5,000 cow level, and they're accounting for a little over 7% of that total Iowa milk supply. So where is the milk going then and now, and what kind of products are we making? The Iowa NASS numbers that I have here showcase 1977 to 1985, showing the decline and decreased butter production in Iowa. And this has continued as butter is produced at larger, more consolidated plants outside of Iowa. But in 1920, before a lot of that fluid milk was being purchased or consumed, a lot of it was made into butter through the 1950 era, as we saw a lot of that production being moved over to cheese. And so then cheese was starting to become more of the prevalent product being made. We know that per capita use of butter has increased in the recent years, increasing from about 4.7 pounds to 5.8 pounds per person from 1975 to 2018. And I just checked the most recent data, and we're right at 6.2 pounds of butter consumption per person per year. And to note, it takes about 21.2 pounds of milk to make 1 pound of butter. If we look at cheese production in Iowa, in 1955, Iowa produced 27 million pounds of cheese. As that cheese started to really increase in demand, and our shift to processed cheese was beginning. Iowa was producing about 2 to 3 times more milk than they were able to consume. So a lot of that was being able to be transported to other states and other markets. And the shift down in cheese production that you see here in 2003 to 2010 was really because of that reduced cow numbers. But as cow numbers and milk production per cow increased in the last 2 decades, so has that cheese production in Iowa. So we're right around 300 million pounds of cheese production. And again, to know, it takes about 10 pounds of cheese, or excuse me, 10 pounds of milk to make 1 pound of cheese. Then we move into ice cream. As I noted earlier, with 7 ice cream processors in the state, ice cream production remains important to Iowa's dairy processing, taking 12 pounds of milk to make 1 gallon of ice cream. Ice cream totals reached an all-time high in 2005 when we saw Wells Blue Bunny move into Northwest Iowa, and they became a major player in Iowa, producing over 75 million gallons of ice cream. And again, to note, it takes 12 pounds of milk to make 1 gallon of ice cream. And finally, yogurt. Another notable trend is yogurt in our industry, as we saw increased consumption in the 2000s and then in early 2010s, with the popularity of Greek yogurt as a contributing factor. Since 2013, per capita yogurt use has decreased, but it has remained substantial, and it's higher than even in the 2000s. So Iowa is still producing a little over 20 million pounds of yogurt, and again, taking 1 pound of milk to make 1 pound of yogurt. So Iowa's farms through manufacturing dairy industries account for $5.56 billion in total industrial output, according to 2017 data, and made $1.7 billion in payments to value added. Of that value added, $891 million was in the form of labor income that supported over 15,000 jobs. So 15,587 jobs were formed because of the dairy industry. So this infographic does a great job of explaining the value of each part of that industry, the number of jobs created within each section to get to that $5.56 billion output. So my last poll question here today, given all the information, the dollar values that I gave you, according to the jobs, the manufacturing that goes on, I'd like for you to estimate what one single dairy cow, or what's the economic impact of one single dairy cow to the state of Iowa. And I'll launch the poll here and give you a couple choices. So if you answered $25,495, that would be the correct answer. We have seen an increase in the economic impact of our dairy cow, as the last economic study showed a dairy cow was at $23,445 per cow. So we are increasing that value of that dairy cow by the number of jobs and the industries that it produces. If you want to read the full comprehensive review of the Iowa's dairy industry, I've included the link here. It's also on our Iowa State Extension and Outreach Dairy Team website, so you can find it there. There you'll find a complete detail and breakdown of all the industry parts that go into that. Now that we know where the industry has been, where we are right now, what does this mean for the future of Iowa's dairy industry? And that's what we asked our 900 Iowa dairy producers this fall in a mailed survey. So they received a survey asking them about management practices, trend lines, and where they're going in the future. The last industry survey was conducted in 2012, and we'd like to continue these surveys every 5 years to develop a trend line for the dairy industry. So while we've just received the data back from the stats department, I can share a few tidbits out prior to releasing the full summary. As I noted, we try to conduct these every 5 to 7 years to build trend lines of Iowa's dairy industry, assess educational needs, and gauge future plans of our dairy producers. So we started these surveys back in 2000. The one in 2000 was more specific to Northeast Iowa. And then in 2005 and 2012, they became more of a statewide survey. So our topics range from farm characteristics, labor management, information sources, dairy issues, and many more questions. So response rates have been tremendous to these surveys, as we see a response rate between 38 and 48%. The 2020 survey was mailed and also emailed this year to 897 licensed dairy farms this fall. But several factors contribute to a lower than expected response to the survey, including the global COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and 2021, and a derecho that caused extensive property damage and crop loss for farmers across central and eastern Iowa several weeks prior to the survey administration. So giving us a response rate of 25%. But nevertheless, it has yielded a large volume of data that is still useful today for our industry. So just only receiving the data just last week, the next few slides only just show a snippet of the information. And I hope over the next few months, we'll be able to provide a more extensive report detailing the results. But for this presentation, I pulled out some of the current impact conditions and what producers are thinking about in regards to their future plans. So here we did ask producers to rate the impact on these specific topics and what impact they have on their farm business on a level of 1 being no impact to 5 being a very great impact. I've highlighted some of the areas that stood out as being great impact to farm business, and you can see those include land prices, commodity prices, milk price volatility, producer price differentials, the dairy imports and exports, and milk hauling costs all rose to the top. COVID-19 was also another area of very great impact to dairy farms. And in another question that we asked, 57% agree that COVID-19 negatively impacted their operation in 2020. We are seeing more producers utilizing some sort of risk management tool, with just over half of the respondents saying they use one or more of these tools. So within those responses, about 34% use the Dairy Revenue Protection Program, 9% use LGM, 18% use milk contracts, and the highest using that dairy margin coverage protection at 86% of those producers who had responded. So from the preliminary data I gathered, there will be some updates to these dairy farms in the next 15 years. I always think it's nice that we ask that question as far as educational needs, industry needs, and what those producers are going to be expanding upon on their operations. So 17% responded that they will be making some type of milking system updates. And I do want to note that 35% of those respondents are milking in tie stall barns, and 16.5% are milking in a herringbone. So of those responses, about half of them are considering some type of robotic milking system, and the other third are looking more towards a conventional type parlor. We don't see a lot of expansion happening with the herds that responded to our survey. So about 76% do not plan to expand at least their herd size in the next 15 years, but they are going to be making some updates to their facilities. So most of them, or a quarter of them, will be making updates to their calf and heifer facilities, manure management, transition and dry cows, and updating their feed storage. So what does the future of dairy farming look like in Iowa? It's important for our Iowa dairy industry to know what might the future of dairy farming look like. Based on the responses back to our survey, 54% say they do not plan to discontinue. However, the other half are making some decisions about discontinuing milking, but still continuing farming in the next 5, 10, or even 15 years. However, there's still strong support to say that family farms are essential to rural Iowa, and that a mix of small, medium, and large farms are important to Iowa's local economies. As we continue to summarize the 2020 Iowa Dairy Industry Survey, we'll keep you informed of information as it becomes available. But as I leave you today, I'd like to share this last slide as it really drives home those values mentioned in my previous slide and the importance of the dairy industry to Iowa. I know that I gave you a lot of numbers and stats today, but if you only remember one number, I'd like you to remember the economic impact of one cow to Iowa's dairy industry. That one cow generates $25,495 of economic impact. So if you are a dairy farmer listening to this presentation, you can multiply this by your herd size and you'll quickly see the value of your dairy farm to your local community and to the state. This number can be used when you're talking to local community leaders and consumers to tell your story, because it not only affects what happens on your operation, but also affects what happens to schools, grocery stores, churches, and local businesses on your main streets. Thank you for listening to today's presentation. And at this time, I take any questions that have come into the chat box.
Jen, while folks are putting questions into the chat box, I'm going to ask you to go over again how often we do these studies and the difference between the comprehensive industry study and our producer study.
Oh, sure, Fred. Yeah, so the producer survey, we started that in an extension, like I said, in 2000, and that was more of trying to get some evaluation and benchmarks across the dairy industry. And we like to update that every 5 years just to kind of watch the trends. Fred, as you are watching market trends, what happens with what dairy producers are doing affects that as well. So kind of just keeping tabs on that, as well as, that economic portion of it. That is done, I think the last one was done, maybe Larry will have to remind me, 2010, I believe. So that's not done quite as often as the dairy survey, but just taking a look at the whole statewide economic impact of the dairy industry in Iowa. It's quite comprehensive to get all those numbers put together when you talk about processing, the jobs, everything that goes into those numbers. So that's kind of the difference between those two.
Now, on one of the slides, a slide from iDolls, you'd mentioned that we have goat dairies in the state. Any handle on where they're located? I know this is a predominantly cow crowd, but they're part of our industry too.
Yeah, I would agree, Fred. If we look at where they are located in the state, we have quite a bit of dairy goat herds in the eastern half, down in southeastern Iowa, more towards Larry's territory, down in that Kelowna area as well, eastern half of the state. But we do have quite a bit of dairy goats. I think we're sitting number 2 or 3 in dairy goat production. So they're, I don't know what the economic impact data would say for them, but I'm sure they're quite significant for our industry too.
Okay, we've got a question. Do other states do an economic analysis of their dairy industry? And how does Iowa compare?
Yeah, I believe Wisconsin has an economic analysis as well. And I think you guys might have to correct me. It's sitting a little bit higher than Iowa. Are they closer to 28? Larry, you live in Wisconsin. You'd probably know better than me.
I think the last one I saw was probably 4 or 5 years ago, raised around 34,000 something per cow. So it's pretty important.
Yeah, and I thought I saw a minute.
Depends.
Yeah. Go ahead.
It all depends on just how things are calculated and things like that. But I think the bottom line for whatever state does it is that people just realize that the cows are economic development engines, and it's a pretty important piece. And we can just look at a lot of the counties in the state of Iowa or wherever where we don't have a single cow in the counties anymore, and just what's happened to their local economies.
We've got a question come in, probably a Larry question. Can you describe the economic impact of organic and grass-fed milk production in Iowa in the last 5 years?
Yeah, so I think when we took a look at what it's gone, so organic industry anywhere from 4 to 6%, depending on the state that we're dealing with. And so Iowa, Wisconsin, the Midwest states, and the Mid-East states actually are quite high. You know, a lot of their organic and even their grass milk production. So I think that 5 to 6% is probably where we're going to hit there. And so I don't think it's that much difference of what you can actually put into it. Yeah, they might not buy quite as many inputs. Milk production per cow though is lower. And so I don't think there's going to be a big difference on what that economic value per cow is going to be before that. But yeah, we're about 5 to 6% of the industry.
We've got another question. Are we seeing the younger generation of dairy farmers being the driving force for the newer technologies and upgrades?
I would say they play a very significant part to that drive in technology as we look at, the younger generation coming back to the dairy. They're more, they've kind of grown up more with that technology in school, college, just in their general day-to-day life. So they are a little bit more in tune with having that technology. So I would agree. I think there is some drive that those younger generation are kind of uh, driving that technology as well, whether that's the robots, automatic calf feeders, looking at animal health sensors. It's just a different way of working and interpreting the data too.
Okay. Larry, this is a question for you. We've seen the number of people per 100 cows go from 10 to now 8. What's happened in the industry for that to go down?
And again, it could be part of how things were calculated, but it's pretty consistent how Iowa calculated it. So it did go down from 10. I think the action one was like 7.1 or something like that. So when you take a look at some of the efficiencies and maybe who dropped out of the industry, could have some of that effect or whatever. But we definitely know that part of our own fault why we over milk production just because I think as producers the dairy industry is getting better and better and better at doing things, and so sometimes we're our own biggest enemy in trying to do that. That as we get better, more milk gets onto the market, and it actually reduces that. And I think labor efficiency is one thing that's been really harped on. I think in the last 5 to 10 years, and has had a big impact. That our farms are undoubtedly getting a lot more labor efficiency, in addition to a lot of things like with lower death losses, higher preg rates, and things like that. And so, as we get better, issues like that are going to happen.
Thank you. We've got a question that I'm just going to throw out there. Is there any processor expansion plans in the works or new processors being built in Iowa?
Well, Fred, I can start that answer and maybe you can fill in, and Larry too. But as far as what I can see, I don't see a lot of new processors. I think there's maybe, updating facilities, processing plants of what we have here in Iowa. I also see on-farm processing increasing. So I think that's a real important aspect when you think about processing. Is we're seeing a lot more on-farm versus maybe some of those bigger expansions. But Fred or Larry, I'd appreciate your comments too.
I would have said about the exact same thing. Is that the interest in the some and these are some pretty small processors as well that are doing some on-farm processing. Otherwise, they're having a cheese maker maybe make the cheese for them, but they're doing storefronts and things like that. And I think it takes a lot of marketing and it takes a lot of work to do that. But I think consumers are actually kind of appreciating that because it's kind of a new little twist of someplace they can go visit and try out some of their storefronts and stuff like that. So, yeah, I don't know of any other big ones that maybe Fred does.
Yeah, I think as producers and industry, we have to understand that the market really doesn't respect state lines. So when we see a new plant at Norton Lake, we know milk from Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota are going to be supplying that plant. Or they see the plant in central Michigan, they know Wisconsin Indiana, Illinois milk are going to go to it. So as we have seen expansion in the upper Midwest on a few plants, we know that it's benefited uh, all over the upper Midwest. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Fred. Well, we are towards the end of our day here, so I want to thank everybody for being on our webinar, sticking through the whole day here. I know it's a lot of information that we gave you, but this webinar will be recorded, and you'll be able to review it. And also, I did post the link to the box where you can get the PDFs of all the information. If there's ever a point where you want to reach out to one of us, you certainly can call us, email us. We're still doing farm visits, so we still like to get out on farms as much as we can here during this time. And I did notice that Fred put in the evaluation link into the chat box there, so we would appreciate if you could click on that, and that'll take you to an online evaluation about today's program. And just again, I want to thank everybody for being on the call and for the great discussion and questions that everybody brought. So with that, I hope everybody has a good day, and we'll see you next time.